If you're making $140,000 a year right now, there's a very real argument that by the economic standards we use to measure poverty in America, you might actually be poor. Not struggling, not lower middle class, poor. I'm talking about the same threshold we used in the 1960s to decide who qualified for food stamps. And before you close this video thinking I've lost my mind, stick with me for about 10 minutes because the math on this is absolutely wild and explains why you might feel like you're working harder than your parents ever did, but somehow getting nowhere. And more importantly, it's going to show you exactly what you can actually do about it. Here's what happened. Back in 2024, a guy named Michael Green published this blog post that absolutely broke the internet. And his central claim was simple but completely insane. He said the real poverty line in America is not $31,000 like the government tells you. It's closer to $140,000. And I know what you're thinking. That's ridiculous. That's some clickbait nonsense designed to go viral. Except here's the thing. He used the government's own formula, the exact same methodology they created in the 1960s. He just plugged in today's numbers instead of yesterday's assumptions. And when you do that, when you actually run the math the way it was originally designed, you don't get $31,000. You get something closer to $140,000, which would mean that millions of people who think they're solidly middle class are actually living in what the government would have called poverty 60 years ago if they were being intellectually honest about it. Now, I want to be really clear about what I'm arguing here. I'm not saying that everyone who makes less than $140,000 is destitute. I'm not saying you need that much to live a good life. What I am saying is that our official measurement of poverty is so completely divorced from economic reality that it's basically useless. And because that measurement is useless, every policy built on top of it, every economic indicator, every headline that tells you the economy is doing great, all of it is built on a foundation that hasn't been updated since Lyndon Johnson was president. And that matters because if you don't measure reality accurately, you can't fix reality. You just gaslight people into thinking they're failing when actually the system is broken. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk you through exactly how the original poverty formula worked, why it made sense in its time, how the economy has completely transformed since then, and what the number would actually be if we measured poverty the same way today. Then I'm going to show you why this explains that feeling you've probably had where you look at your paycheck and think, I make decent money, so why does it feel like I'm always broke? And finally, I'm going to give you the 3 things you can actually control in a system that's designed to make you feel like you're treading water forever. Let's get into it. So let's start with how we got here. Back in 1963, the government asked a woman named Molly Orshansky to figure out what poverty actually meant in America. And this was harder than it sounds because poverty is subjective. One person's broke is another person's comfortable. So Orshansky needed a framework, something measurable, something concrete. And here's what she did. She started with food. Because back then, food was the single biggest, most predictable expense for a family. It was about 1/3 of a typical household budget. And she figured if you knew the bare minimum cost to feed a family of 4, you could work backwards and estimate everything else. The logic was pretty simple. If food is 1/3 of your spending, then your total budget is roughly 3 times your food cost. So she calculated the cheapest possible food budget for a family of 4. That number came out to about $1,000 a year. Multiply that by 3 and you get $3,000. That was the poverty line in 1963. If your household made less than $3,000 a year, you were officially poor. And here's the thing, that formula actually made sense for the world it was designed for. Because in the 1960s, one income could support a family of 4. Childcare costs weren't a thing because one parent stayed home. Healthcare was cheap and usually covered by your employer. Housing was affordable. You could buy a house on a single salary without destroying your life. College didn't cost more than a car. And wages actually grew with inflation. So your paycheck kept pace with your expenses. It was a different economic universe. The formula reflected that universe. But then the universe changed, and the formula didn't. Instead of updating the assumptions, instead of adding new categories like housing and healthcare and childcare, instead of adjusting the ratios to match modern spending, the government just froze the formula in time. They took that original $3,000 number and said, okay, we'll just adjust this for inflation every year. And that's it. That's all they did. So today, if you adjust that original $3,000 for inflation, you get about $31,000. And that is the official poverty line for a family of four in 2025. $31,000. Now you might be asking yourself, why would they do that? Why wouldn't they just update the formula to reflect reality? And the answer is because updating it would be politically catastrophic. Here's what would happen. If the government recalculated the poverty line using modern spending patterns, millions of people would suddenly become poor on paper overnight. And if that happened, the government would be legally obligated to expand welfare programs, spend billions more on assistance, and acknowledge that there's a massive economic crisis happening. And no politician wants to do that. So instead, they just keep using a 60-year-old formula that tells everyone the economy is fine, unemployment is low, inflation is cooling. Poverty hasn't really changed. Everything's great, except it's not. Because every single category that defines modern life has completely flipped since the 1960s. Back then, food was your biggest expense and housing was cheap. Today, food is one of your smallest expenses, and housing is the single biggest financial burden for most families. Back then, healthcare was negligible. Today, it's a massive line item that can bankrupt you if you don't have insurance. And even if you do have insurance, you're still paying thousands of dollars a year in premiums and deductibles. Back then, childcare didn't exist as a cost because one parent stayed home. Today, if both parents work, childcare costs as much as a full-time salary. Back then, you didn't need a college degree to get a middle-class job. Today, you do. And that degree costs more than a house used to. Back then, you didn't have mandatory car insurance, health insurance, renter's insurance, all these things that are legally required now. And on top of all of that, the tax burden on middle-income families has gone up significantly while taxes on the wealthiest Americans have gone down. So let me ask you this. If every single assumption in the original formula has been inverted, why are we still using it? And more importantly, what would the number actually be if we recalculated it honestly? This is where it gets really interesting. There are actually two ways to think about this. The first way is the original Orshansky method, which uses ratios. The second way is the modern method, which just adds up actual costs. Let me walk you through both, because they're both kind of wild. First, the ratio method. Remember, the original formula took the cost of food, which was a third of your budget, and multiplied it by 3. That's your poverty line. But today, food is not a third of your budget. It's closer to 6%, maybe 7%, depending on where you live. Now here's the part that sounds completely backwards, but actually makes perfect sense once you think about it. If food shrinks from 33% of your budget to 6%, the multiplier doesn't stay at 3, it becomes 16. And I know that sounds insane. You're probably thinking, wait, if I'm spending less on food, shouldn't I have more money left over? But that's not how it works. Because the reason food is now only 6% of your budget is not because food got cheaper. It's because everything else got astronomically more expensive. Housing exploded. Healthcare exploded. Childcare exploded. Transportation, insurance, student debt, all of it exploded. Food stayed relatively flat. So the ratio flipped. Let me give you a concrete example so this actually makes sense. Let's say you spend $10,000 a year on food. And let's say food is 10% of your total spending. That means your total budget is $100,000, right? 10% times 10 equals 100%. That's the multiplier, 10. So if your food cost is $10,000 and the multiplier is 10, your total income needs to be $100,000 just to cover the basics. That's the threshold. Anything less, and you're functionally poor by the original standard because you don't have enough left over after essentials to save, invest, or build wealth. Now, let's use a different essential to make this even clearer. Let's use rent, because rent today takes up about a third of most people's income, just like food did in the 60s. So the multiplier is the same. 3. If you're paying $2,000 a month in rent, that's $24,000 a year. Multiply that by 3, and you get $72,000. If you don't make at least $72,000 and you're paying that much in rent, you probably don't have much left over for anything else. And you definitely don't have much left over to invest, which is the only thing that actually builds wealth. Now that's method 1. Method 2 is even simpler and honestly more brutal. Instead of using ratios, you just add up the actual cost of things families can't avoid paying for today. You need housing. You need healthcare. You need transportation. You need food. And if both parents work, you need childcare because somebody has to watch the kids. So let's use national averages, not New York or San Francisco, just boring middle America numbers. Rent or mortgage, about $24,000 a year. Childcare for 2 kids, $32,000 a year. Healthcare premiums and out-of-pocket costs, about $8,000 a year. Transportation, car payment, insurance, gas, maintenance, about $12,000 a year. Food for a family of 4, about $10,000 a year. Utilities, internet, phone, another $6,000 a year. Add that up and you get $92,000. But that's not your gross income. That's your net income. That's after taxes. So now you have to add back federal income tax, state income tax, and FICA, which is Social Security and Medicare. That's another $18,500. Now you're at $110,500, round up for wiggle room and unexpected expenses, and you land somewhere between $120,000 and $140,000. That's what a family of 4 needs to make just to cover the basics in 2025 without going into debt. And here's what's so crazy about that number. The median household income in the US right now is about $80,000. That's with 2 earners. But the second both parents go to work, they immediately trigger that $32,000 childcare bill because somebody has to watch the kids while they're working. So the second income isn't lifting the family up. It's just paying for the childcare that allows the second person to work. It's a treadmill. You're working to pay someone else so you can go to work. That's not building wealth. That's just treading water. And I think that's probably why so many younger people are choosing not to have kids, because they're doing the math and realizing it doesn't work anymore. Now, I can already hear the objections because I know exactly what the comments are going to say. So let me just address them right now. First, someone's going to say, well, I don't make $140,000 and I'm doing just fine. And yes, obviously, there are people who make less and still make it work. But this number isn't supposed to represent luxury. It's not accounting for vacations or iPhones or Starbucks or any of that stuff people love to blame. This is modest housing, basic healthcare, bare minimum childcare if both parents work. That's it. No extras, no buffer, no room for error. If you're making it work on less, you're either living somewhere significantly cheaper, you're making sacrifices the formula doesn't account for, or you're going into debt to cover the gap. Second, someone's going to say, well, not everyone has kids, so this doesn't apply to me. And that's true. But the original poverty formula wasn't created for singles. It was created for households. And in the 1960s, every household assumption included children because that was the norm. One parent worked, one stayed home with the kids. Today, that stay-at-home parent role costs $10,000 to $15,000 a year minimum if you outsource it. So if we're using the same logic, childcare has to be included. You can't compare a 1960 family structure to a 2025 family structure and pretend the costs are the same. Third, someone's going to say, just move somewhere cheaper. And look, I get it. If you can't afford to live in San Francisco, don't live in San Francisco. That's real. But even the cheapest states in the country now have housing costs that are historically high relative to income. There's a national housing shortage. Moving to Indiana or Alabama might save you some money, but it's not going to magically make the system functional again. You're still playing a rigged game. You're just playing it on a slightly easier difficulty setting. Fourth, someone's going to say, well, healthcare shouldn't be included because that inflates the number. But in the 1960s, healthcare was about 5% of a family's budget, and it was mostly covered by employers. Today, between premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket costs, healthcare can easily take 15 to 20% of your income. And it's not optional. You legally have to have it. So, if the original formula included the biggest essential expenses of its time, the modern version has to do the same. You can't just ignore a massive cost category because it's inconvenient for your argument. Fifth, people are going to say this number is inflated by expensive cities. But it's not. This calculation uses national medians. If you only looked at major coastal cities, the poverty line would be way higher, probably closer to $200,000 in places like San Francisco or New York. So if anything, $140,000 is conservative. And finally, people are going to say the article was debunked, or the numbers are inflated, or the author had an agenda. And look, you can debate the specific assumptions. You can argue about whether childcare should be $32,000 or $25,000. You can argue about whether healthcare should be $8,000 or $6,000. But the broader point stands. The official poverty line is based on a formula that hasn't been meaningfully updated in 60 years. And if you apply that same formula to today's costs, you don't get $31,000. You get something way higher. Maybe it's not exactly $140,000. Maybe it's $120,000. Maybe it's $150,000. But it's definitely not $31,000. And pretending it is doesn't help anyone. So why does all of this actually matter? Because if we're measuring reality wrong, we can't improve reality. We just gaslight people. The government says unemployment is low, inflation is cooling, GDP is growing, poverty hasn't moved, everything's fine. But none of those metrics describe what life actually costs in 2025. Inflation is cooling, sure, but that doesn't mean prices went back down. It just means they're not going up as fast. You're still paying more for rent, more for groceries, more for childcare, more for insurance, more for everything. Slowing inflation doesn't erase the last 4 years of price increases. It just stops making it worse at the same rate. Unemployment is low. Great, but that doesn't tell you whether people's jobs actually cover their cost of living. It just tells you people have jobs. Sometimes multiple jobs. And they're still struggling. Full employment doesn't mean financial security anymore. It just means people are working. GDP is growing. Fantastic. But GDP grows when corporations make more money, when asset prices go up, when rich people get richer. It doesn't tell you whether a middle-class family can afford a house or save for retirement or send their kids to college without taking on crushing debt. The macro can look amazing while the micro is a disaster. And that's exactly what's happening. The big picture numbers look great, the lived experience feels terrible. And when the government tells you the poverty line is $31,000, so if you're making more than that, you're doing fine, but your rent is $2,000 a month, and your health insurance is $1,500 a month, and your childcare is $2,000 a month, and your car payment is $500 a month, you start to think, am I crazy? Am I bad with money? Am I doing something wrong? And the answer is no, you're not crazy. The assumptions are wrong. And that brings me to the real problem. If the poverty line is outdated, and the middle class definition is outdated, and the economic indicators don't reflect reality, how do we even know what reality is? What's the baseline? What's the standard? And here's the part I really don't want you to take away from this video. This does not mean you need to make $140,000 to live a good life. That's not the point. The point is the system is lying to you about what normal is. And once you see that, once you understand that the gap between what you're told and what's real is enormous, you can stop blaming yourself and start focusing on what you can actually control. Because there are things you can't control. You can't control housing costs. You can't control healthcare costs. You can't control inflation. You can't control childcare costs. You can't control government formulas or GDP or any of that macro stuff. But you can control your savings rate. you can control your investing habits. You can control whether you stay in the market during downturns or panic and sell. You can control whether you automate contributions or spend everything you make. You can control whether you buy assets or liabilities. And here's the thing, the poverty formula can't measure. Wealth doesn't come from income alone. It comes from time and compounding. You could have a household making $40,000 a year, and if they invest consistently from age 25 to 65, they'll end up with more wealth than a household making $150,000 that never invests. Because the poverty formula measures survival. Investing measures possibility. The formula tells you whether you can cover this month's rent. Investing tells you whether you'll be financially free in 20 years. And that's the game you actually need to be playing. Not the game of hitting some arbitrary income threshold. The game of building ownership. Ownership of anything that grows faster than inflation. Stocks, real estate, businesses, index funds, whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you own something that compounds, because that's the only reliable path to wealth that still works. So here's what I want you to walk away with. 3 things. First, if you've ever felt like you're working harder than your parents, but getting nowhere, you're not imagining it. The system changed. The costs exploded, the formula didn't update, and now you're being measured against a standard that doesn't reflect reality. So stop blaming yourself. You're not failing. The baseline is broken. Second, the most important financial decision you can make is not how much you earn, it's how much you keep and what you do with it. A high income without savings is just expensive poverty. A modest income with consistent investing is generational wealth. The difference is habits, not salary. And third, the one thing you can control in a system designed to keep you broke is ownership. Own assets, stay in the market, automate your contributions, let time do the work, because compounding is the only force strong enough to overcome a rigged game. The old metrics are broken, life is more expensive than it used to be, the middle class is being squeezed. All of that is true, but your financial future isn't decided by any of that. It's decided by whether you understand the game well enough to play it differently. And if you can do that, if you can build the right habits today, you will outperform people who make twice as much as you. You'll outsave them. You'll out-invest them. You'll out-compound them. That's the edge. That's the system within the system. And it's the only one that actually works. So yeah, $140,000 might be the new poor, but that doesn't mean you're stuck. It just means you need to play a different game than the one they're telling you to play. And if you do that, you win.